Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar to discuss the draft report on the resiliency of South Carolina's electric and natural gas infrastructure against extreme winter storm events. We will be discussing the draft report and have two panelists on today's webinar, but before we introduce them, I'm Landon Masters here with the Office of Regulatory Staff, and we'll be helping to coordinate the Zoom webinar portion, not presenting, but helping on the logistics side. So I have a couple of housekeeping notes before we get into the meat of the presentation today. We are using the Zoom platform, so you will see there should be a ribbon in your Zoom window that has a couple of options there. There's a chat function as well as a Q&A function. So we do ask that if you're going to put questions in there, that you use that Q&A function, which allows us to answer that question directly and you to be able to see the log of those questions. But you can also use the chat function if you're unable to figure out that Q&A section. We'll be monitoring both of those and answering questions throughout the webinar, or answering those questions live. So we may stop and address a question if it's pertinent to what we're talking about at that particular time. You should be all muted. So there will be a live question answer session at the end of the webinar. And so at that point, if you'd like to unmute, you can click the raise hand button if you have a question, and I will allow you to unmute your line so you can ask that question live. Or as I said, you could put those questions in the Q&A box of the webinar. We are recording today's webinar, so the recording will be available as well as the slides from the presentation on the ORS website, and we will send those out to all of the attendees and that have registered for the webinar. And feel free to share those with folks that you may know that were not registered or weren't able to attend the webinar today. So with that, I will turn it over to Michael Seaman Wynn, who is going to kick off the webinar today and start talking about the draft report and the ORS.
All right, thank you so much, Landon. First off, I want to confirm that, Landon, I can be heard and that y'all can see the presentation.
We can.
All right, great. Thank you so much. And good afternoon, everyone. And thank you for joining us on this webinar to discuss ORS's draft report on the resiliency of South Carolina's electric and natural gas infrastructure against extreme winter weather events. As Landon said, my name is Michael Seaman Wynn, and I am the Deputy Director of Energy Operations and the project lead for this study. In today's webinar, we're going to discuss the draft report that ORS and Guidehouse have assembled based on information received from utilities regarding grid resiliency. As Landon mentioned, the chat box will be open for questions during the presentation, and then we'll have a Q&A function session at the end. So wait a minute, next slide, there we go. All right, so why are we here today? So today we're going to provide an update on the history and the current status of the project. We're going to provide an overview of the assessment framework used in the draft report. We're going to identify preliminary findings, and then we'll go on to discuss next steps. And then finally, we'll address questions regarding the draft report or next steps that anyone may have. So as we all remember, the extreme winter weather events in February of this year led to challenges for both the electric and natural gas utilities in Texas and left many customers without service during dire winter conditions. To ensure that South Carolina is well placed to meet similar challenges, Governor McMaster requested that ORS undertake a comprehensive review of South Carolina's public and private power grid to evaluate their ability to withstand potential ice storms and other dangerous winter weather. In May, ORS retained Guidehouse to assist with the research and analysis in this project. As you are aware, ORS and the Guidehouse team have been very busy since our last webinar. We have issued dozens of discovery requests to all of the electric and natural gas providers in the state. With Guidehouse, we have spent hundreds of hours of research and analysis on this project. All this work culminated in the draft report that was published on September 30th. So how was the report conducted? How was the study conducted? In a few minutes, I'm going to turn the webinar over to Jamie Bond with Guidehouse. Jamie will discuss how Guidehouse conducted their review and analysis and provide an overview of the draft report's preliminary findings. So what is not in the draft report? The draft report does not include information related to the responses to ORS's second audit information request. Those responses were received while the draft report was being finalized and were not incorporated into the initial analysis. The draft report also does not include ORS and Guidehouse's best practices and final recommendations. These will be included within the final report. Finally, the draft report does not include specific utility details or information, but is in aggregate form for the 4 categories used in the analysis. If there are questions regarding a specific utility, ORS would be glad to have individual calls to address them. So as you all know, Guidehouse has been working with ORS on this project. Specifically, Guidehouse has been performing the roles included on this slide under ORS's direction. So Jamie Bond is the project manager for Guidehouse on this project and has been the lead in coordinating with ORS since May of this year. She's been coordinating the numerous efforts of Guidehouse in a variety of review areas. Jamie has an MBA from Wake Forest and a master's in electrical engineering from Penn State. She has nearly 20 years of energy industry experience with a focus on project programs and initiatives related to grid modernization, grid resiliency, and utility transformation. Jamie, I'll turn it over to you.
Michael, thank you. And so for Guidehouse's part, I'll provide insight on how the Guidehouse team approached the assessment framework used to conduct the assessment, and then we'll provide some preliminary findings that you would have read in the draft report. So Michael, if you want to go to slide 8, I think it's important to give the participants a view of how Guidehouse conducted the evaluation. So you'll note here, we had an assessment team of 10 professionals, 10 Guidehouse professionals. This was our core evaluation team. We had a dedicated set of evaluators focused on the electric utility assessment. So this is inclusive of the bulk electric system and the associated, regional interties that's under the authority of CERC, and regional coordination at the sub-region level, so the Vicar South. So we looked at that area. This also includes, of course, the transmission system, the distribution system for both, electric IOUs, state-owned utilities, electric cooperatives, and electric municipal utilities. And then similarly, we had a dedicated set of evaluators that were looking at the natural gas system. We do anticipate tying in a bit more information about the interstate gas transmission companies. And I think we might have noted that in the draft report. And to this point, we have one of our evaluators that's solely looking at fuel supply, resiliency, and its contribution to the contribution of generation to the resiliency of the South Carolina power system. And then we had analysts who supported the brave souls that they were. We threw a lot at them, and they came in a clutch to help. And then, I provided the overall project management and supported compiling the findings into the findings from the evaluators into the draft report that you would have seen, and for the final report. And then lastly, we had a member from our Guidehouse Guidehouse Insights research team who supported the team through conducting industry research. And she's conducted research and has provided input to the team for best practices from the industry and relating specifically to winter weather events. So I think we incorporated roughly 20 industry reports and studies that focus on winter weather into the framework that we use, which I'll talk about in just a moment. And in addition to that, the best practices that we have reviewed and incorporated into the assessment framework, we're also compiling, and we'll include that in the final report. So the last point I'll make here before we move to the next slide is just to highlight just the sheer amount of material that the assessment team processed these past few months. To launch our assessment, the evaluation team looked at the 20 sets of docketed comments that came in. These would be the initial comments and then any reply comments that were submitted to the commission. And then we also reviewed the utility, the data request responses and associated attachments. So we were provided roughly 800 documents to review, some of them very large, thick documents. And our assessors reviewed those data request responses and attachments. And I'll just note that nearly 200 of those responses attachments were considered confidential material. And just to give you a flavor of the kinds of documents we looked at, in addition to the data request responses, distribution integrity management plans, transmission integrity management plans, emergency response plans, inspection records, lessons learned reports, capacity planning, load transfer plans, contingency plans. So lots of processes, procedures, so lots of things related to the resiliency space across a multitude of areas. So I'll move to the next slide to talk a little bit about the assessment framework we use for adverse weather. The framework that we used to conduct the assessment, it leverages a capability maturity model integration process. So this is an approach that was developed by Carnegie Mellon's Software Engineering Institute. Some of the utilities participating in today's webinar may be familiar with its application in our grid maturity model. So this would be the same underlying framework. Given the scope and gravity of the study, we elected to take this more methodical approach. We hoped it would enable us to easily characterize our findings and the rationale behind our findings. We want to make sure that the report that we issue at the very end is defensible, that there's a agreement and alignment with all of the ultimate findings, and that the use of this framework supports just the overall credibility. And for this type of, because it was a fairly large study and it was fairly expedited, but using the framework helped us do this, especially with multiple evaluators and wanting to have consistency of the evaluation across, again, the multiple evaluators and the different types of utilities. And the last point I'll just make here is this kind of approach is really a good application for this kind of study because it's methodical, it's consistent, and our team was able to streamline a bit because we knew exactly what we were looking for, again, from that evaluation criteria that was, again, informed by some of the best practices and standards. And then in looking at looking through the lens of this framework, it helps us easily identify what specific gaps exist and where there's improvement opportunities. And then should we go back and look just hypothetically at the conduct a similar assessment in 2 years, we'll be able to see kind of from an apples to apples comparison where there's been maturity over in a particular area. So just I'll hit a couple points here. The framework is focused in across 5 areas: people, process, technology, as well as data analytics and governance. And we were looking at these 5 dimensions across 11 indicator areas. So those 11 areas would include things like the emergency management planning, the mutual support and staffing, how utilities are communicating with their stakeholders and with the public, what your emergency plans, the utilities emergency plans look like, the degree of automation use, situational awareness capabilities, compliance with regulations, standards, things of that nature. So the 11 indicators, the 5 dimensions, and then the output of the framework, the output of the framework, the assessment framework we used gave us a scoring of maturity across those 11 indicators, those 5 areas for 11 indicators. So I'll talk a little bit about how we conducted the preliminary reviews. If Michael, you want to go to the next slide, just one more point I wanted to make here. We did conduct this assessment for individual utilities. So at the individual utility level, notwithstanding there were a couple of groups of utilities that were represented by an entity such as the South Carolina Association of Municipal Power Systems. They submitted responses on behalf of a group of utilities, and so we conducted an assessment for them, for that group of utilities as a group. But we did conduct the, like I say, individual utility assessments. And once we completed the preliminary assessments, we compiled the results into 4 groups. The groupings were based on the type of utility, so electric versus natural gas, and the size of utilities. So the large IOUs, the state-owned utilities being in one group, and the smaller cooperatives and municipalities being in another group. And so those 4 groupings that we have are the large electric utilities, small electric utilities, large natural gas utilities, and small natural gas utilities. And we did this really recognizing that in general, the findings are going to have greater applicability at the size level and definitely at the utility type level. And more importantly, any recommendation that we make for improvement is going to be most applicable by these categories. So that's the rationale for the grouping. You can see, if you've looked at the draft report, table 7 identifies the specific, how utilities, what categories they've been specifically grouped in. And that's also illustrated here on this view. I've noted the individual assessments that comprise of the grouping of the four categories. And then, Michael, if you want to move to the next slide, I'll just get to the preliminary findings, the summary. So based on the materials that the evaluators reviewed, again, this is inclusive of materials that was docketed, the comments that were provided, data response requests, data request responses that were provided to the ORS and then to Guidehouse evaluators, and even the interviews conducted where needed. Anything that was prior to August 31st, we would have incorporated into the preliminary assessment, understanding that we are still continuing to get information and are continuing to complete the final assessment. So from a preliminary standpoint, evaluators determined that the South Carolina power system does appear to be adequately prepared to prevent or withstand prolonged outages caused by ice storms and winter weather events. From an individual maturity scoring of the 11 indicators you see on the screen here, and again, this is reflective of draft report table 9. By and large, the utilities of South Carolina are pretty middle of the road, falling in the foundational area, which is foundational maturity, that center area maturity. It signifies that foundational components that would prevent or help withstand prolonged outages, that they are in place and that, you know, general industry standards are being adhered to, or at least adopted. We will also note that the least mature areas, so you see that indicated with the little orange circle, the least mature area that we observed thus far is the for automation for the small electric utilities. So the score of 1 there just represents a lagging maturity. It signifies that there's some foundational components in place and that there's definitely opportunity to mature the automation capabilities to support winter weather resiliency. So just an example, not to pick on the little guy literally, but we have the small electric utilities. You know, several of the electric utilities in their data request responses mentioned that they do have very basic, have the basic SCADA control systems. There was not a lot of description around how those the SCADA control system, the SCADA systems, how the extent to which it's deployed, and then it's how it might be integrated with the outage management system. But additionally, there were some recognition that there were distributed automated devices that were deployed for some utilities. It wasn't consistent across the whole group of small utilities, and that there was AMI in place. As far as the more advanced distribution automation, information provided from the small electric utilities varied, but there were, you know, more so than not, there was not any very robust distributed automation program. So we saw that as an opportunity for the small electric utilities to improve their resiliency against winter weather events. Conversely, we saw the highest level of maturity in the area of energy management and planning, and this was for the large electric utilities. So that score shown in with the green circle of 3.7, which notes, you know, leading maturity. So this signifies that in addition to having the foundational components in place to support resiliency during winter weather events, that these utilities are beginning to implement forward-looking plans, practices, et cetera, to really, you know, position them to lead the space in winter weather resiliency. Notably for the large electric utilities, you know, they noted, you know, they have incident command structures in place. They're fully integrated. Are trained specific to emergency management roles. Personnel are the training program. Sorry, I was getting an error on my screen. The training programs are fully tracked. The competencies of the personnel conducting business continuity activities according to the business continuity plans are there and in place, and that personnel is trained. And so again, that was the area where we saw the most maturity across the spectrum, given what we've seen thus far from information provided by the utility providers. Lastly, I'll just note, or you may have noted when you looked at the draft report for those who did, that there were a couple of areas in the small natural gas utilities that are marked as not rated. And this is primarily due to just insufficient level of information available at the time that we completed the draft report. And so we recognize, I think there's additional data requests that have been issued and some responses that have come in. And so we would anticipate being able to conduct most, if not all, of the assessment prior to the issuing of the final report. So Michael, I will turn it back over to you and let you guide us through the rest of the webinar.
Thank you, Jamie. That was a wonderful overview of all of the work that we have been conducting over the last few months, and greatly appreciate that. So where do we go from here? Well, obviously we are not done yet. Over the next weeks, ORS and Guidehouse will continue to add additional information and update the draft report until it reaches its final conclusion. It is our intention to produce a report that is a full and complete representation of the South Carolina and electric and natural gas infrastructure's ability to withstand winter weather events. We will be adding additional information from numerous sources, including responses to the second audit information request, additional comments that are provided through the Commission's docket management system, as well as new developments on either state or federal level. And the final report will be issued by the end of this year. So with that in mind, Landon, if you would like to open up the mics, we'll open the floor up to questions that have not already been addressed.
Yes, so we have a question that came in. I don't know if we want to address that, but before we get there, I will remind folks that the Q&A box, not the chat box, is open. So if you do have questions about the presentation, feel free to put those in the Q&A box. And if you'd like to be unmuted, there should be a button to raise your hand. So if you'll just raise your hand via the Zoom platform, I can unmute you if you want to ask that question live. And so we have a question from Stephen regarding indicator 11, compliance to regulations. I don't know if you or Jamie would be the one to answer this, but what did Guidehouse look at specifically in making its evaluation? I'm particularly interested in how they did this evaluation with respect to the LEU category.
Jamie, this one seems to be directed towards Guidehouse directly, so would you mind addressing it, please?
Yes, I moved my screen and lost my mute button. I will get started, and then I'm going to tag my fellow evaluators in. So for the indicator 11, the regulatory compliance, this will look at things like, what is the culture of compliance and ethics within the utility being assessed? Is there a governance mechanism in place that supports effective compliance? And then you get into the maintenance of the compliance programs from an ongoing base. Is compliance something that there's mechanisms in place to help with compliance from an ongoing basis? And I'll pause for looking for either Ed or Jean to weigh in on the large electric utility, if there's anything that you wanted to add there.
Yes, if you guys could raise your hand, I'll unmute you. If you want to add.
I don't. I think they were all shown as me.
Oh, okay, there we go.
Yeah.
I see a hand raised. There you go. You should be able to unmute yourself.
Hello, can anyone hear me?
We can, yes.
Background noise because I am actually in an airport. This I did for the so to indicator 11.
Ed, you're breaking up quite a. You're breaking up quite a bit. So.
Than against the regular.
Ed mentioned he was.
My connection is spotty, so yeah. Apologize that Dean can take over.
And Ed, I apologize. You told me you were going to be at an airport, and of course, you're the first person I named. So maybe Jean can help.
Yeah. Thank you, Jamie. Actually, I think you've gone over the most of the key criteria in terms of how we assess regulatory consistency with requirements, internal cultural requirement, cultural situation with regard to ensuring that there's environment to ensure that there's continuous compliance. And so as well as the organizational structure that's in place to ensure that the regulatory requirements are being met. So it covers a pretty broad spectrum of regulatory issues, compliance type issues. And so in the utility responses, which we relied on quite heavily to ensure that each of those categories are fully assessed in terms of degree of compliance, what processes are in place, procedures. And so we looked at a lot of documentation in terms of what utilities provided to ensure that they're indeed are in compliance, with a number of regulatory related issues. So I think you've described a number of those quite well.
Jane, thank you. Hopefully that addresses the question or gets at what the asker is looking for, Stephen, what Stephen's looking for.
Thank you. Yeah, and I'll also say that we will have your contact information for folks. If they do have additional questions, they can ask those. And we did get a question through the Q&A box about, has a schedule been established for the submission of reply comments to the draft report? And we have responded and said that we've not set a formal schedule, but we would appreciate any comments to be filed with the commission promptly. So we answered that question in the Q&A, as well as once again, the PowerPoint and the presentation in this recording will be available after the webinar today. And so we have some other questions that have come through, or a comment as well. The commission's docket is open for comments right now. So that is open for folks to submit their comments. A follow-up question from Stephen regarding indicator 11, specifically what sets of regulations were evaluated. And this may also require some follow-up after the webinar if we don't want to get too in the weeds there. But so for example, he gives the NERC suite of reliability standards or something beyond that.
Yeah, Jamie, I could jump into that one. One thing we looked at very carefully, and this applied more to the large electric utilities, is degree of compliance with the NERC regulations regarding power system reliability, compliance with planning criteria, reliability criteria, compliance with maintenance procedures, for example, tree trimming or vegetation management type activities. So there's quite an array actually of regulatory compliance in terms of utility technical compliance in terms of meeting the reliability standards, and whether or not they're meeting those, whether the analyses and information they're providing to NERC is consistent with those requirements. So thank you for that question. And we found generally by and large at the bulk system level, when we're dealing with the transmission system, compliance, level of compliance tended to be a bit higher because it's quite critical that the power delivery system at the high voltage level and bulk generation system is reliable.
Thank you. Hopefully that answered the question. And I'm not seeing any more questions come through the Q&A box or the chat box. But once again, if folks have a question that are participating and would like to unmute, just click the raise your hand button and we can do that as well. And Michael, do you have a slide with contact information?
Absolutely, Landon. Just checking to make sure there wasn't anything else. If there are no other questions at this time, then I'm happy to give everyone back a small portion of their day. Please feel free to reach out to me should you have any follow-up questions. As Landon stated at the beginning, this webinar and the presentation will be posted shortly to the ORS website. If there's nothing further, then thank you all for attending and appreciate it very much and hope that you all have a great rest of your day.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.